for several years, I taught Adobe Flash and how to do animation and drawing and interactivity with Adobe Flash, creating web applications and creating even desktop applications. And I loved Flash. It was great for doing animation. It was designed for that. And I still have a whole playlist out here of videos that I did for that course if you're interested in learning more about animation. Visual Basic is not designed to do animation. However, with the timers, there are still ways that we can do animation and even create some games, some animated games within Visual Basic. Let's take a look at doing animation in Visual Basic using timers. In this first example, I have a form that has a background image of the sky and the mountains here, and then a label called LBL balloon, and it contains an image of a balloon that I pulled from a public domain website, and then a button called BTN Animate. There's also a timer, TMR balloon. I set the interval to 25, so 25 microseconds, and the enable property to false. The code's pretty simple. I created my random number generator object for the TMR balloon.tick event. I'm setting the left value of the balloon by checking to see where it's currently located. If it's past the right-hand side, so if it's greater than me.width, I'm going to move it way over off screen to the left. Otherwise, I'm going to increment that by 5 pixels. Now this is firing pretty quickly, so it's going to move just a little bit each time, but that's going to happen pretty quickly over time, and we'll see the balloon move. And then I randomly just simply have the balloon move up or down with this LBL balloon.top value being changed by rnd.next7 -3. The -3 lets me both decrement and increment that top value. And then my animate button is simply changing the enabled property of TMR balloon, toggling it with the not value that it currently is at, and then changing the text of the button to say either pause or play. Let me run this. I'm going to play my animation, and there you see the balloon moving to the right and moving up and down a little bit as it moves. As it gets to the right-hand side and goes off that screen, the left property of my balloon is going to be greater than the width of my application. It's going to move it far over to the left and continue the animation coming in from the left-hand side. Because I can pause, I can continue, and pause again. Animation sequences often include sprites of a character or an object in varying states. We often refer to these as a walk cycle because it's pretty typical to use sprites in having a character walk across the screen, whether it be a 2-legged walk or a 4-legged walk. In this case, I can pause the animation and I can start it again. Now this animation is much like the balloon in that I'm moving a picture box across the screen from left to right, but within that picture box, I'm changing the image to use sprites or different positions of the character being cycled through. So in this case, there are actually 7 different images being used to create this walking effect. We can look at the sprites. So there are 7 of them. There's my sprite 0, sprite 1, sprite 2, sprite 3, 4, 5, and 6. And you can see how the character walks across the screen. So now these sprites are transparent. They are PNG files, so we can see the background behind us, which is this nice photograph. And with the sprites being sequenced like this, we can iterate through them in a loop very easily. In the design of my application, I have a panel here that I pop up to show the sprites. The character itself starts on the left edge of the screen. This is a picture box, and I'm named Pick Wally. My character is named Wally. And then my 3 buttons to play, pause, and show this panel of the sprites or hide the panel of the sprites. And my form has a background image. For the code, I'm creating an array of type image, that is showing my 7 resources of those images. Those are all put into the resource folder. They were imported into the picture, and I'm simply setting that image array to my.resources.wally0, my.resources wally1, and so forth through wally6. I have a variable called Sprite num, which is going to keep track of the index number as I'm moving Wally across the screen. Then my timer for Wally, and my timer is set to an interval of 150, so about 6 times a second, a little faster than 6 times a second. The enabled property is false. So in the tick event for that timer, I'm setting the Sprite num equal to 0 if the Sprite num is 6. So I'm cycling back around from 6 to 0. Otherwise, I'm going to increment Sprite num by 1. And I'm going to set the image of Wally. I'm going to set the image of my picture box to Wally where the element Sprite num is. And then I'm moving Wally 275 pixels to the right by changing the left property. Once I go off the screen, as I did with the balloon animation, I'm going to bring it back over to the left-hand side and have him walk back across again. So this animation repeats. It's a looping animation. Now I think the animation probably work a little bit smoother, that I discovered in the next project I'll show you, is if we move it first and then change the sprite. It just makes a slight difference. I didn't do that here, but this still works. My play button is setting tmrwally.enabled property to true, and the pause button sets it to false. And then that panel that's showing the sprites is this BTN Sprite panel toggle. That's my button that's toggling that panel on or off. I'm simply setting the visible property to whatever it currently is not. And then showing those different sprites, I've got my 7 buttons. I'm going to set all of them to light gray, set the one that I'm clicked on to yellow, and then I'm simply showing the pick sprite picture within that panel, setting the image to wally.elementIDX. In the previous 2 animation demonstrations, I used what's called a set shot, in which the camera is in one position. We see our action move across the stage. Here's an example of a tracked shot, also referred to as a truck shot or a dolly shot, as the camera moves with the principal character and we see the background moving. This is much harder to do in Visual Basic, and there's a reason for that, in that to have a transparent sprite, it has to be contained in something. I can't have it contained in the picture if the picture is moving. That picture is another object. It's not a container. It's a picture box. The picture box is not a container. Whereas before, those background images were part of the form, which is a container. The problem is you can't have overlapping transparent PNG files or a transparent PNG on top of a moving object that is not the container. And if you're moving the container, then the object moves with it. Eventually, my way around this was I created a second form with that form being transparent and laying on top of my main form. So the second form is the container of my Roddy sprites, but the animation that's scrolling in the background, that image, is a picture box in my main form. And so it allowed those two to sufficiently interact. And I can pause the animation and resume the animation. And I'm actually pausing 2 timers, 1 on each form, or enabling 2 timers, 1 on each form. We haven't talked about creating multiple forms yet. That'll be next week. I'll show you very briefly how this was done. I wouldn't have you do a project like this at this point, but I want to show you the possibilities. And this would be great for creating some type of game where we have characters that are moving with a background that might also be moving, or other characters that are moving against a background. And maybe we want those different characters to be able to interact or pass over one another. We'd have to put each one of those on a separate form. Here's my main form. Simply contains a picture box. Notice this picture box goes way across the stage here. My form is 640 wide. My picture box and the image in it is 1920 pixels wide. And I did that because I want this to be a seamless transition, And I'll show you what I mean by that. I'm going to jump over to Photoshop. Here in Photoshop is my 1920 wide image. I started with a photograph that was 1280, and I copied the first 640 pixels over to the right-hand side. So you'll notice that the first third and the second third really are the same. I added in the cactus, and I put this cactus here. This is the seam between the second third and the third third. I put that cactus there to help hide that seam. So in the animation, as my picture box is moving to the left, when that seam between the second third and the third third hits the left-hand edge of my form, I move the entire picture box back over to the right. So I'm placing that third third with the first third, and the animation can continue to scroll, and that just simply repeats. That's how we use a seamless background in an animation. And that picture box is named Pick Background. I also have a button named BTN Animate. Text is set to pause. I'm going to have this animate automatically when we load the form. And then I have a timer here of TMR Animate, and I set the interval to 200. So basically 5 times a second it's going to do the animation. And I set the enable to true. That way it does the animation as soon as the form loads. Then in my project, I right-clicked on the project and chose Add, and I added a new item, which was a form. And I named the form FRM Roddy. Here then is the design of that second form. And you can see it's basically the same size as my label sprite, 250 by 199. I gave it a background of dim gray and set the transparency to dim gray. Now this is like working with a chroma key or a green screen. But rather than using green, I chose to use dim gray. And as long as those two are the same, this will be transparent. The problem with green is I got a little bit of a green border around my Roddy that's transparent. Just a single line of pixels it spots. That to me was distracting enough that by choosing gray, you don't really see it. It just looks like part of the outline of the Roddy. So that's why I chose dim gray, kind of a dark gray. In that form is my label called LBL Roddy. I have an image list called IMG Roddy that contains all of those sprites. There are 24 sprites in this case for the Roddy. It's the walk cycle, but it's also during that walking, the Roddy turning its head towards the camera and then turning back away from the camera as it's walking. And the image size is 250 by 209, so it's a little bit bigger than actually my form, and that's okay. I'd probably recommend making them both the same size, but there's some space at the bottom of this Roddy within the sprites. The important thing is the sprites are all aligned when creating them. And I created these, again, I created these in Flash, and then I copied, brought them into Photoshop, and made them into individual PNG files in Photoshop. There's also a timer here called TMR Walk. I have its interval set to 100, so 10 times a second, the Roddy's going to walk. So those two intervals do not need to be the same. So we're scrolling the background at one pace, the Roddy is walking at another pace. The code for this form, very simple. I'm going to dim walk IDX's integer equals 0. That's a global variable. And then my timer tick event, my walk IDX, I'm going to increment it by 1 unless it equals 23. Remember our sprite indices go from 0 to 23. So if it's 23, it's no longer less than 23, I'm going to set it back to 0. So we're going from 0 to 23 and then back to 0. 0 to 23, back to 0. And then I simply set the image index of that label to the sprite image in the image list. My main form, kind of doing the same thing, got IDX here. And then I've created Roddy as my form Roddy. It's a new FRM Roddy that's going to set up my additional form layered on top of this form 1. And my timer here is I'm going to change the pick background picture box. Its left property, I'm going to move it to the right by 10 by subtracting 10. So moving the left edge over to the left. Until that left edge is a minus 1275 or higher, then I'm going to set it back to 0. So when that picture box gets pretty far to the left, there's just 1/3 of my picture remaining. I'm going to shift it all back over to the right and start back at the left edge of that picture box. My animate button enables the timer, true or false, based on whether it's play or pause. I also set Roddy, remember that's my new form, Roddy.tmrwalk.enabled. So I can reference the timer on that other form by referencing the form first with the dot notation. And again, I'm going to set it to true or false. And then this third line changes the caption of the button between pause and play. That makes it all a toggle. My form load, I named it setup, and I Roddy.left equals me.left plus 200. So it's going to be 200 from the left-hand edge. And then Roddy.top, this is the top edge of my Roddy form, is going to be 250 pixels down from the top of this form. I'm going to make that Roddy form the topmost, so it's always on top of my form 1. And then I'm going to choose to show it. And the other issue I notice, if I move my form 1, the Roddy doesn't move with it. I always want that Roddy to stay in the same place. So I created an event handler to handle the form.location change. Anytime I grab that title bar on form 1 and move it around, I want something to happen. What I want to have happen is that Roddy to move with it. So the same specs that I used up here when I initially set it up, I'm going to move that Roddy form with my main form. Let me just run this one more time and demonstrate that to you. So here's my Roddy running. If I move the form, notice the Roddy goes with it. The Roddy doesn't move. It stays in that same spot. Now, I'm going to stop for a second. I'm just going to comment those out. Let me run it again. So there's my Roddy walking in the form, but if I move the form, the Roddy does not move with it. That creates a little bit of a problem. So that's how I solved that problem. If you just jumped into this video, you can see all the videos from the Programming Practicum playlist by clicking on the image in the lower right. And if you'd like to be alerted to future videos I create, you can click my picture in the top right to subscribe to the channel.